when I started college, I went to UCLA. I did not go into Russian studies from day one. I did my Russian, I did my physics, I did chem labs, all these things. But then I really wanted to get back into something a little bit more colorful. So I considered studying another language. This was 1985. This was Gorbachev had just come to power. This was glasnost. It seemed like it was something very exciting. Those were the days when China didn't exist. Nobody spoke about China in those days. It was really the Soviet Union. If anything, it was the Japanese who were going to take over the world. I had already studied other West European languages, so that didn't really satisfy my desire to do something exotic. So it really came down to what else could I do? And I had this background in, curiosity about the Soviet Union. Also, Soviet Union was just sexy. It was still the Cold War. It was still the world of James Bond, nuclear weapons. And Japan is really cool, but they weren't as badass as the Russians, okay? Like, this was something that was a little bit more fun. Plus, I felt Cyrillic I could master. I wasn't quite sure about, kanji. Then what really clinched it was on the Slavic Languages and Literature department at UCLA. They had an ad which said, "We have ways to make you talk," which I thought was cute. This was before Facebook, so you didn't have all these memes every day. You weren't saturated with this kind of stuff. In those days, that was actually kind of funny. So again, being very cautious, staying in my mathematics major, I thought, well, maybe I'll audit the Russian class and see what that's like. That way I don't have to commit to it, and maybe these people are really good. They're very serious. Slavic language majors, that sounds pretty hard. So I audited my class, and the first thing the teacher said in the morning was, "Здравствуйте." Like, okay. It's like, that means hello. It's like, well, if that means hello, there's really not very much hope. Okay. But anyway, I stuck with it and liked it. I liked it enough to then actually take the class for credit and then take another one. And eventually I found out you could do something called a double major. I'm a Gemini, so I think this is part of my schizophrenic nature that I've continued throughout my life. So I decided to keep my major in math because I didn't want to let that go. But then I added a major in, what do we call it? Russian civilization is what it was called there. The Slavic languages and the Slavic languages major involved linguistics and a whole lot of things that sounded very weird to me at the time and I wasn't interested in. I kind of regret that because I think linguistics is a very neat field. If you have a chance to do that, I would recommend it because it's unlike anything else you've ever seen. But anyway, I didn't do that. So that was a field that was a lot like what you have available to you in the Rees program, namely, your language and history and poli-sci, and a couple straight, what they called civilization classes. So I completed that double major, and then, like any good college student without, an undue amount of focus, I decided to go to law school. I thought that would again be a nice conservative choice in terms of giving me a platform either for being a lawyer or going into another field. This is the United States after all, so that's always a good place to start. So I applied to all the U.S. News and World Report schools and tried to see where I would get in. And it came down to a choice between a few schools. I was interested in Michigan, not only because I visited and it was a lot more attractive place than University of Chicago, say, but here I knew from the start that there was the CREASE program. There are a couple other schools that have this, at least at the time Columbia had a program like this, but it really wasn't very widespread. Harvard had something in public policy, that sort of thing also sounded interesting, but this was really much closer to what I had already studied, and I thought that this might be something I might wish to pursue. So I entered the law school at, I'm sorry, just before I back up, before getting to law school, before we finished college. So I entered law school in 1989. I had the chance a single time to visit what was still then the Soviet Union. I went there for the first time in 1988. there was an organization, I think there still is an organization, called the United Nations Association of the United States of America, UNA-USA. So this was an organization which very idealistically was designed to promote, American interest in the United Nations. And what they organized in December of 1988 was a trip for college students from around the country to go and visit the Soviet Union, namely Moscow and Kiev, and speak with a group of Soviet students and debate some local issue. This was the time of the war in Grenada, okay? Or rather, it was a little bit after the war in Grenada, but that was, nothing like the wars we have today. This was sort of the level of what was going on, so it was a little bit lower temperature. I remember very vividly going to the Soviet Union and immediately conforming to all the stereotypes. It was December, it was very cold. The first evening we visited Red Square, the beautiful church, had a little bit of snow, like a little bit of confectionery sugar on top, with the guards in front of the wall. It was very striking. It was everything I ever hoped it could be. What was sad is that this was about a few weeks after the great earthquake in Armenia of 1988, in which about 25,000 people had died. And what was very striking was all the flags, the Soviet flags, at the top of the mast, they had a little black ribbon. So there was solidarity from the whole country for the tragedy that had struck in Armenia. And the students that were our counterparts were not just Russians. They came from Central Asia. There was a student from Azerbaijan. There was one from Armenia, Georgia, and maybe a few of the Baltics. And the sense I got at that time was really that, although we've always in this country said Russia, it really was Soviet. And this, I've been able to confirm with my wife and with other people from that part of the world in our generation, that there really was an identity of being Soviet as opposed to being Russian or something else. Now maybe that was not quite as strong in some republics that felt a little bit more separate, but by and large, and even at the time between Armenians and Azeris, the Azeri student actually had given me a gift, I remember, which was it was a record, it was still a vinyl record, of Armenian jazz. And that was striking for me because we had always heard in the United States that, the republics, they all hated being dominated by the Russians. That was not entirely true. And certainly what's happened since the fall of the Soviet Union, you can no longer imagine Armenians and Azeris, giving you a gift of Armenian jazz when you're from Azerbaijan. And that's been something personally sad for me to witness since, as we were all euphoric in the West about the triumph of democracy in the former Soviet Union and how wonderful it is. Well, not so much when you have Armenia and Azerbaijan fighting each other or Russia going into Georgia, issues in the Baltics and other places, not to mention Central Asia. So there's still quite a bit of work to be done there. And I think that incidentally, this is what can make your careers interesting in a way that is different from mine. In my day, when we were thinking about working in the former Soviet Union, it was really these ideas, the thing you're writing about, building bridges between East and West. I don't think that that's even part of your vernacular anymore. I don't even know to which extent the concept of East and West makes any sense. If you've been to Russia and other republics now, you know that it's really not the Soviet Union anymore. When I went the first time in 1988, there's a large, beautiful department store on Red Square called GUM, which you may know. And in those days, you went into GUM, it was all little stores selling these znaczki, these little communist pins, or tkani. They would sell cloth from which you could make your own clothes. Very low-end, ordinary, store number 25, things of that nature. And if you go there today, it's all Hugo Boss and Elizabeth Arden. Stores that frankly make New York look pretty shabby in comparison. In Moscow, you have a Porsche dealership on every corner. It's really quite a striking place. It's changed spectacularly. So I think for you, the change, although some of the Cold War sexiness has gone, and the Soviet Union no longer wins as many medals in the Olympics, It's become a much more complex place, which I think makes your job as students a little bit more challenging to piece together. I think it also gives you ultimately more job opportunities, because since a lot more people have gone over there or even here, you don't even have to be in New York anymore to work with Eastern Europe. You can be pretty much anywhere. So back to law school. I started law school and went through, the horrendous drill that you will know if you're in law school, of going through the first year, learning about contracts and criminal law and constitutional law and all these things, which is a rude awakening, being with a bunch of other extremely bright students. And although I was interested in Rees from the beginning, being cautious, being a law student, I didn't apply for it at the beginning. I decided to explore it when I was here. And increasingly in the first year, it looked like a good idea. Again, more color. Law is fine, but something with a little bit more oomph, I thought, would make my life here more enjoyable. So I visited Greece. I have to say that from the beginning of my exposure to Greece, Marisha has been a person who's been a great inspiration. I think she encouraged me and helped me a lot to decide to actually to take this degree, and she's been a very good friend and help throughout my whole career. So Marisha, terrific. Thank you again for that. I was another element that helped my decision was I was fortunate enough to get something called a FLAS, which is a foreign language area scholarship. At least at the time, Russia was considered a strategic language to the United States. Hopefully it still is. And the beauty of that scholarship is it paid ultimately for a year and a half of tuition, which is not nothing. So that was also a nice sweetener. I gather those are still available, right? You still have those here. So in my second year of law school, I started the Greece program, and I continued my study of the Russian language with a very charismatic, colorful professor named Nyusnya Milman, who is now at Virginia Tech. There was a political Russian class and a business Russian class. This is where I met Bill Burnham, who was also in this class. And in this class, we did fun things like we made videos. This was before you had it on your iPhone. You actually needed a camera. I mean, we did have VCRs and things like that, but it involved a little bit of logistics, and you couldn't do it on your Mac. Anyway, as a class project, the students had to make a video in Russian, of course, and then we had to present it to the class. And we did, I think, I don't know if you were in my group, but my group, the first one we did a parody on Roger and Me, the Michael Moore film, and it was Gorbachev and me, and it was kind of like the Jimmy Stewart movie where he dies and the angel comes back and shows him everything that wouldn't have happened. So this was Gorbachev who dies and comes back and is shown everything. Then we filmed that everywhere on campus, and we were very proud of ourselves. Anyway, it was, immediately the contrast with, and I like law, and I'm glad I chose this career in the law school. But it's just so much more fun doing this sort of thing, and graduate school is just so much more fun than law school. I mean, it doesn't compare. So this was a big help in even just bearing the stress of law school and worrying about getting a job. And by now we were getting into 1991. There was a big dip in the market, so students were quite stressed. This was very pleasant in addition to being quite useful. I took classes in history with Ronald Suni, in political science with Zvi Gettelman, and did that. In fact, I then prolonged, I liked this so much, I started this in college. I did 5 years in college to do the double major, and then I did 3.5 years here at Michigan to finish the joint degree. My advice to you is stay in school as long as you possibly can. It's great. You're not going to regret it. You have your whole life to work. This place is great. Take advantage of it. My last year, I had already graduated law school. I had taken and passed the New York bar. I had finished enough credits for the Rees program. But I said, hey, what the hell? This is great. I'm going to stay here. At that point, I had been accepted to my law firm. I wasn't dating anybody. It was the most free I've ever been in my entire life. I could wake up every day and say, what shall we do today? I was taking classes to try and justify my existence. I started learning German and doing some other things. But still, every day was just a big canvas. Life was free and life was wonderful. That's the other thing, you think as students that you're very busy. You have your classes and you have your homework and you have your finals. What I've discovered since in the working world is looking back, when you're a student, you're not busy at all. You're just disorganized. You have very few classes during the week. If you're smart, you can schedule them all on Tuesday and Thursday. Reading for your courses, once you've done law school for about a year and a half, you understand how it works. Graduate school, you can also do various interesting things. You have a lot of time, so get organized. I'm still trying to get organized. I think I'm a little bit better, but I'm not quite where I want to be. And you'll have reams and reams of time to read Russian novels or play basketball or whatever it is you like to do. But do take advantage of that time, because then life takes over and you're not going to have it anymore. So I was living this idyllic life, being free. And then I was cursed with a great opportunity, which Bill also helped to bring about. I discovered the existence of an organization called CELI, C-E-L-I, which at the time was the Center for the East European Law Initiative. They've, like your center here, they've changed their name a couple times, so now they're worldwide. Anyway, this was a program of the American Bar Association, which was trying to promote the rule of law in the newly independent states of the former Soviet Union. Now it still exists. Now it's called ROLI, Rule of Law Initiative, and now they work on the entire planet. This experience, I left early. I didn't stay all the way till May. I had to go in April. It was an opportunity to work in Russia for 4 months. So it was an actual practicing lawyer from Chicago, and I, young student, still had long hair, to go to Russia, to go live in Nizhny Novgorod, which was the former Gorky. This is where Andrei Sakharov was exiled. And our mission, should we choose to accept it, was to go to Nizhny Novgorod and work on implementing the brand new Russian bankruptcy law, which had been adopted in 1993, November of 1992. So it's like, I was a student, I didn't know better, said, hey, this sounds fun, let's do it. So I go there with this colleague. He was not a Russian major, but he had always been interested in it. He spoke Russian, not as well as I did, but he had actual legal experience, which I did not. So we completed each other a little bit. And this experience of working in Russia for the first time was a great watershed in my life. The first thing I'd like to say is this organization, ABA ROLI, I would highly commend it to you, regardless of the part of the world you're interested in. They have paid positions, unpaid positions, positions in Washington, D.C., and positions in the field, around the world, in the capital cities, in the remote provinces, doing anything you can possibly imagine, from, criminal law to women's issues to constitutional law. And they come out with a newsletter every month, and they advertise all these positions. And especially in a tight job market, I've recommended this to other people who have come to me now for career advice. I think it's a useful place to look into. And there's also short-term assignments and longer-term assignments. And ultimately, having worked there, I think has been a benefit to my career. As I'll get to later, it was instrumental in my working at IFC, where I work now. Anyway, this was a watershed, not just professionally. In a sense, it was my very first job, other than being a summer associate in law firms, where I was actually in the field on my own. Well, it was this other person, but not in a university environment. And that's where I made the transition from being a good student of Russian to being an actual Russian speaker, and feeling that I actually speak this language and I can function in it in situations, social and professional, because there were no crutches. My colleague did not speak very good Russian. We didn't have interpreters. We're in the provinces. People did not necessarily speak very good English. So I had to do everything in Russian, which was quite uncomfortable at the beginning. But the beauty of foreign languages in the professional context is you can actually learn them very quickly because a professional vocabulary is very limited. So once you've learned the 200 key concepts in any language, even languages you don't know very well, you read a few contracts, you can start to understand it if it's similar to another language that you know. So, once you do that, you get used to it, and you can actually function quite effectively. Unlike studying literature or reading a newspaper where the vocabulary is a lot more extensive, in the professional context, you can do it. So if you are studying Russian or another language and have an ambition to work in those countries, it can be done, it should be done, but language is really a key issue, and ultimately there's no substitute. This experience also satisfied, or rather remedied, a regret that I had both in college and in law school, which is unlike a number of my peers, I had never done a semester abroad. People would usually go and study for 1 semester somewhere in a obscure metallurgical institute someplace and supposedly study Russian. I can only imagine what they did there. But I never did that and regretted it, and this finally gave me an opportunity to do something similar, to work and live in the country. So I did that. We, after a number of picaresque adventures, did find a company to put through bankruptcy, semi-voluntarily. And this was a knife factory in a place called Vacha, which was Nizhny Novgorod is already in the provinces of Russia. This was in the provinces of Nizhny Novgorod. Anyway, working with some of the local people in the staff, this was a time when the governor of Nizhny Novgorod was Boris Nemtsov. You may have heard of him because he's now a semi-prominent figure in the Russian opposition. At the time, he was the star young governor of reformism. He was governor of Nizhny Novgorod. All the, Margaret Thatcher and all the prominent Westerners would go on pilgrimage to Nizhny Novgorod to see what it means to be a reformer in Russia. He was a former nuclear physicist. He was young and dashing, and he was the face of the new Russia. Anyway, I had a chance to work directly with him, so he knew who I was and what we were doing. And we started what turned out to be the first bankruptcy case in Russia using this new law. Ultimately, unfortunately, it didn't work. The company did not pull out of bankruptcy, and the company failed. Whether this was because of the bankruptcy process or because of other factors, I don't know. But nevertheless, it was the first time this law was actually used. So that was kind of a fun thing to do as a relatively new graduate. And it's something I obviously could never have done if I had not had the credential. I mean, not just the law credential, but also the REIS, which gave me some credibility despite the fact that I didn't actually know anything at the time. So after this event in my life, again, the conservative side of me picked up. And I did have to go back to the real world, so I made good on my promise to the law firm in New York and started work as a regular U.S. associate in the fall of 1993. Now, in selecting a law firm, in those days, now you have, you have over 50 foreign firms in Moscow. In those days, you did not. There were a few pioneers that had started, like Couder Brothers, which is a firm that no longer exists, Baker and McKenzie, White and Case. There were some firms that were just going to Russia, and there were some other firms that had interest groups, people who were looking at what was going on. But anyway, they were advertising this. So there was an opportunity to go to a firm that was actually going to move to Moscow. Ultimately, what I decided to do, though, was to go with a firm that I thought at the time was the quote-unquote best firm, as a platform that I could always move to, as some place where I would want to move from. So I started as a corporate lawyer in the firm of Davis Polk & Wardwell in New York, and did securities law, completely unrelated to Russia. And as I found out relatively quickly, Davis Polk and Wardwell, nice white shoe firm, was not terribly interested in those days in doing work in Russia. They worked in the Christian Dior label type cities, Paris, London, Tokyo, and that was kind of it. It was an interesting time for learning my craft. I did the 24-hour days and all the good stuff that you do in a nice New York law firm. I did a lot of international work. I did privatization, and I did privatization work ultimately in Japan. With them, I was able to live and work in Japan for 1 year. But I did a lot of work in Latin America. In those days, oil was $10 a gallon, a barrel. And so there were a lot of securitization deals. This was before structured finance acquired a bad name, and you could securitize the oil receipts of companies like PDVSA in Venezuela and Pemex in Mexico. And so these were nice, big, sexy deals that people were doing. And those were some of the fun things we were able to do back then. But again, not very much in Russia or the former Soviet Union. There was a Eurobond. We tried to do a Eurobond representing JP Morgan in Ukraine. And so that was very exciting because I was able to join the team, and I was the only one who actually knew something about the region. So we actually went back to Kiev. Some of the very same ministries that I had visited in 1988, which were then Ukrainian, Republic ministries, were now full-blown ministries of Ukraine. So that was a little bit of an interesting homecoming to see. And we started doing the Eurobond deal, but ultimately it fell apart. And what was interesting to me is that I think the attitude of the other lawyers who were, Americans and English, maybe the partner I think was from South Africa, they didn't really see it as anything special. This was another place where they were going to do their business, and I think they thought it was all fine and good that I knew something about the region, but it didn't have the resonance for them that it had for me. And ultimately, I think it represented a little bit of an attitude that I wouldn't characterize necessarily as arrogant, but I think at the time there was a sense that, well, yeah, this is all changing and this is all fine, but there's really nothing so special about this place. We're this great law firm, we're working with this great investment bank, that should be enough for people. Ultimately, it's not enough for people. There was another chance to do a deal, which was a huge mergers and acquisitions deal between oil majors in Kazakhstan, and we put together the bid proposal and talked about all of our experience all over the world. We did the Exxon Mobil merger, we did all these things all over the place, but where we were not strong was on work in former Soviet Union. So that was a big hole. We did not, for the purpose of this bid, partner with a local firm or even another international firm that would have had a presence that I thought would have made our bid stronger. So as a result, we did not get that particular deal. So I was left working there. I had a very good experience, both professionally and personally, although the work was quite intense. I wanted to get back into my Russian work. So this was all during my first year. At the end of my first year there, I met, Bill alluded to my wife, Olga. I met at the swearing-in ceremony to the New York bar. She was a Russian lawyer, had finished Moscow State. She was working for 6 months in New York. Her term was coming to an end. She had to go back because of the fellowship she had. Her visa had expired. Anyway, she couldn't stay there. So then I started having thoughts of maybe going back to Russia. Again, being cautious. I didn't want to quit my job at Davis Polk, especially since I'd only started. And I started looking for other ways to go there that would not involve going to another law firm, but looking for something else to do. So I started looking at the ads in the front pages of The Economist and talking to people and making various inquiries. And one thing I found out about searching for jobs in those days is there's both a method to it, there's a science, and then there's karma, there's job karma. And to get the good job karma for finding a job, you can't rely on how good you are and how good you think you are. You need to accept that you're going to have a lot of misses, But as you start to acquire momentum, responding to all of the different offers, you eventually close the circle. You understand what the universe of jobs are, and I believe that when you really get into it, you start to acquire this job karma, and you really maximize your chance of finding the job or the job finding you. You shouldn't discriminate too much, saying, "Oh, this is not so interesting. I'm really looking for the ideal job." So eventually, doing this, I stumbled upon the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, which is where I am now. But in those days, I was not. And what they were doing was a land reform project in Russia. So they were engaging in a program where they were going to help reorganize all the kolkhozes and sovkhozes in Russia, putting together an auction process. And they were using an outside firm. They were using a New York firm, which was costing them a lot of money. So they were hoping they could get a U.S. lawyer to come in and help manage the legal process a little bit, reduce the legal bills, and take on some of that work in-house. So, thanks to my experience in Nizhny Novgorod, where I had met the IFC people the first time, in those days they were doing a small-scale privatization program. I'd become friends with a number of people working in there. They knew who I was. They did a little bit of due diligence on me. What I think clinched it was one of the IFC staff who was working there at the time, who's still my friend, now he's still at IFC. He did due diligence on me. He actually asked Governor Nemtsov, whatever he was doing he was still governor at the time, and he just said, "Oh yeah, Edwin Paxson, good guy." So it's like, okay, so I think that clinched it for me. So again, this first experience, you can never neglect any experience that you're getting. It will either come back to help you or haunt you later on. So I got this position despite the fact I was only a first-year associate at a law firm. I was essentially put in charge of whatever it was, 20 lawyers, Russian lawyers who were working within this program. And that was a little bit intimidating at first, but eventually, like anything else, if you put your head to it, you can survive. I stayed in that program for 2 years, living in Moscow this time, not in Nizhny Novgorod. And we put together, it was originally funded by USAID, then it was funded by the British Know-How Fund. We did a program where we developed, it was primarily run by the economists, but there was obviously a legal component in terms of putting together the contracts and organizing what the auctions might look like. It was a program that was rolled down in 6 provinces of Russia, including Nizhny Novgorod, and Rostov-on-Don, Ryazan, Volgograd, however many that is. Maybe I'm missing one. But anyway, several different provinces of Russia in different parts of Russia with a different agricultural profile to reorganize collective farms. And so this process was developed. It was put into some handbooks that ultimately were distributed to all 20,000 farms apparently throughout the country. And there were a number of pilot projects that were carried out, auctions. Essentially the concept was, okay, you have the collective farm, you attribute shares to all the collective farmers who are there based essentially on how long they've been there. So you get bidding rights, and then you divide the whole collective farm, the land, into one set of shares, and you divide the equipment into another set of shares, and then you let the people in an auction using these rights bid on the land and on the equipment. Now obviously it's not going to be terribly efficient if you let every person become their own individual farmer, although some people did decide to do that. So part of what the program did was to introduce corporate governance schemes where people, before doing their bidding, would unite into larger partnerships. So obviously some of the people who were leaders in the collective farm in the collective time would become the head of whatever partnership or company, and you would have then entities of different sizes that were bidding on the elements of the farm. But the idea was that you could break it up and that people would then operate on market concepts. So that program was rolled out, met with some successes, some places it was less successful. To the extent it was less successful, I think it's not because the concept was unsound, but it was because it was too limited in focus. what we focused on was reorganizing the farm itself, but in an industry like agriculture, there's a whole chain that comes into place. It's not just the farming, it's, well, how do you get the inputs for your farm when you need you need fertilizer, you need new tractors. Then you need storage facilities so your milk will not go sour. Then you need distribution channels. You kind of fit into a whole chain, and this was a little bit early in the process. So there really was no chain for them to fit in based on market principles. So it was a little bit difficult, especially for some of the people who were out in the more remote regions. Now that's completely changed because now, I mean, you have completely modern ISO standard agricultural enterprises throughout Russia and Ukraine, and they can get financing directly from IFC or other places. So I did that for 2 years, and ultimately, again, felt I had not sufficiently learned my craft as a lawyer, so I came back to New York, did some more of these deals like I was telling you about. Had another interesting opportunity with Davis Polk in 1999, which was to work in Japan. Not because I knew anything specific about Japan, but because they were looking for somebody to go there for 6 months to bridge when somebody else was supposed to go there. But that sounded like a lot of fun. I spoke about it to my wife, and she said, yes, let's go. She was working as an associate still at Kuder Brothers. She was able to convince them that she should go there as well. Anyway, we put it all together. We started taking intensive Japanese classes, and we went to Japan, and that was tremendous fun. Whether it's Russia or Japan or somewhere else, I would encourage you all to live abroad. I mean, living abroad, there's really no substitute for the experience, not just in terms of language, but even things like the ads you see in the subway become interesting. There's nothing that's not interesting about living abroad, and it's an opportunity that will give you experiences that will last you your lifetime. What was striking, though, was being in Japan. Even though I thought I knew something about Japan and Japanese culture, I didn't know very much about Japanese language. And it was a huge difference living in Japan as a foreigner who didn't know the language and living in Russia as a foreigner who did know the language and did know the culture. Not just because, okay, in Russia most people are white and in Japan you're obviously not, but what was very striking in Japan is that Australians are extremely good at Asian languages because they learn Japanese and Chinese the way we learn French and Spanish, and some of them actually become quite good. And one day you could be talking like, and then they turn around and immediately they speak like a native Japanese, which completely freaks out the Japanese because they don't think any foreigner can possibly master their language. But any language can be mastered. There's idiots in every country who speak the language. There's no reason you can't learn any language, no matter how allegedly difficult it is. So for me, although it was fascinating living in an Asian culture, I didn't get nearly as much out of it or feel that I was part of it to the same extent I was in Russia. And that's, again, where I think the program here at Rees and what I had learned was key in my ability to operate and to appreciate and to be effective in my work in the country. In 2000, I finished my term in Japan, came back to New York. Always had this idea in the back of my mind that IFC, where I had worked previously doing land reform, was something that might be interesting to me. And there was an opportunity that arose in 2003. I mean, jobs, it's like a window. It opens and it closes. Right now it's closed because we're doing a big decentralization program. Anyway, in 2003, at the top of the housing market, when I bought my house in DC, the window was open again, and I decided to jump. And my wife was supportive. Her firm also had offices in DC. She was able to continue her. By the way, she's a Russian lawyer, also qualified in New York and in England and Wales. She does work in Russia, which she did it from New York, she did it from Washington, she did it from Tokyo. So there are also opportunities for working in Russia, even if you're based abroad. So we moved down to DC, and there I was, be careful what you wish for, because there I was able to work in Russia and Ukraine to my heart's content and beyond. I did a number of deals. My very first deal was for Raiffeisen Bank. We did a $100 million equity It's a big Austrian bank with branches throughout Eastern Europe. So that was a lot of fun. My first mission was going to Bratislava. And so I remember landing in Vienna, being picked up in a Mercedes, driving to Bratislava. You know, a cool thing, you get in the World Bank group, you get a nice light blue United Nations passport, showing that at the check. It was like James Bond, so that was really, that was really great fun. Deals in Russia itself, in the financial sector, deals, juice companies in Ukraine. Russia, from being, you know, a new thing. When I was working at IFC the first time in 1993, there were two people there in the investment section. I was doing the technical services, the investment people. It was really just starting. You know, there were no investment opportunities at the time in Russia. By 2005, you know, Russia had become the top portfolio country for the entire IFC. More investments were made there than in any other country. So that was quite a turnaround. In fact, it's to the point that, you know, for where I am in my career today, I've kind of come full circle. So Russia for me, I like it, I live it every day, I'm married to a Russian, I work in it. It's not exotic for me, it's lost its exotic. Whether I'm in New York or in Moscow or doing Russian, English, it's kind of all the same. So I've done it so much to the point where I can do it, but it doesn't have this kind of, you know, sexiness that it did at one point. So now I'm trying to do other things. The way we work within IFC in our legal department is, things are very complicated within the World Bank Group, but we have regional affiliations and we have industry affiliations. And I do a little bit of both. So I work primarily as a liaison in what we call the manufacturing and chemicals department. So I help them, you know, assign people to work on their deals. But I also, since I'm one of the few Russian speakers, I work in the region called EMENA, which is Europe, Middle East, and North Africa. So I work a little bit throughout that region, and I try and moonlight doing things in Africa and some other places. But ultimately, you know, and wherever you wind up, and you'll wind up in different places in your career throughout, I've never regretted for a moment the additional step, and there was some extra effort and logistics involved in doing the joint degree here. It was a key part for success in my career. It's a very competitive world out there, and it really gave me a plus. You know, obviously, if I had not been a law grad, I could not have become a lawyer, but being a lawyer and differentiating myself from other lawyers and having opportunities that they did not have, I would have been stuck being a corporate lawyer in New York, maybe succeeding in that, maybe not, winding up, you know, in-house at a Wall Street bank, maybe getting laid off in the financial crisis. You know, doing something that might be relatively interesting, compensated okay, but ultimately something that a lot of other people do. And I think what this type of program does is it can set one on a different trajectory. And you may stay on that trajectory for your whole life. It may lead you some other places, but it definitely does open doors that you may not have otherwise. I would like to close before, you know, I would welcome any questions that you have, and happy to talk with you. If you ever want to find me, I'm on LinkedIn, you know, so feel free. I love talking to students and people. I did that when I was a student, so I think that's part of the circle of life. Just one story. So when I was in Nizhny Novgorod looking for my bankruptcy victim, the way this worked was the lawyer and we had some counterpart minder type people who were assigned to go around with us, because obviously we didn't know where to go, what companies to look for. So, you know, they in the administration, they selected some potential companies that we might be able to work with and to go and visit. So we visited a vodka plant in Arzamas, which is where they had a secret weapons site, also at the time, this place called Arzamas 16. We visited all different types of industries. And one day we were coming back after a hard day visiting the factory, And so there were two cars, two official cars, the black Volgas issued by the government with the drivers. So, my counterpart and I, we were in one, sitting in the back, and then in the other car there were the two guys, and we were going down a nice, Hotel California-esque lonesome highway in the middle of nowhere. It's a nice day, kind of like this, birch forests. And all of a sudden, the cars slow down and pull off the highway along a little dirt road in the forest with no warning. So I look at Kurt, so like, you know what's going on? It's like, no, I don't know what's going on. It was just the driver. And we were a little bit fazed by this. And I'm like, well, what do you think is going on? It's like, well, I think they're going to kill us. Literally, you're in the middle of nowhere and you have no idea what's going on. So we go deeper into this forest, and so I guess we probably should have asked what was going on, but for whatever, when you're scared, you don't always think of these things. So thoughts were more of the like, because like, well, we'll show them how an American dies, bravely. And the cars stop, they get out of the car, the driver goes back to the trunk, opens the trunk, and he pulls out an impromptu picnic. So some sausage, some vodka, some sardines, some bread, and it turns out that there is a tradition called Zelenaia Stoyanka, so it's like green stop. So frequently what you do when you travel is you make a green stop, you stop somewhere in the middle of nowhere, and you have a little picnic. So this was an element of the culture of which we were unaware at the time, and we learned then what this is. And we were even worried by then whether the driver was drinking vodka and maybe whether that was such a good idea. And we were just so relieved, the mosquitoes, forget the mosquitoes, that's all fine, this is good, let's have the vodka. So you can never have too much culture, you can never know too much about the place you work. And the good news is that acquiring that experience can actually be very, very pleasant, in addition to hopefully very, very useful. So thank you very much.